I'm going to go ahead and start anyhow. And the first couple of slides are more or less, here's where we're going to go. We're going to discuss the project facilities, our FERC license renewal, and water sustainability. And to begin the discussion, we'll start with a description of, okay, tab. Spacebar not working. We'll try this. Okay, got it. Benefits: surface water irrigation, over 220,000 acres delivered of surface water. 220,000 acres received surface water irrigation from the project. 110,000 direct delivery, Central's irrigated area. Another 110,000 to supplement natural flow. And it's in two parts. One group is handled by Nebraska Public Power District through storage contracts, and Central District serves another group of canals directly with supplemental storage water. Another 300,000 acres of groundwater irrigation receives recharge from Central's facilities. Over 1.1 million visitor days of recreation at Lake McConaughey. Fish and wildlife habitat throughout the Central District project, and we'll get into more detail on that in a little bit. 110 megawatts of hydroelectric power from Central hydro plants. Picture of Kingsley Hydro at Kingsley Dam, Lake McConaughey. Power plant cooling. Picture of Gerald Gentleman Station, coal-fired plant on Sutherland Reservoir, 1,370 megawatts, largest unit in the state, and receives cooling water from Lake McConaughey as that water is headed for other uses. And flood control, and it's incidental flood control. No dedicated flood storage in Lake McConaughey, but significant benefits in years of high water like 2010, 2011. We'll talk a little bit about facilities now. The Kingsley Dam, left part of the slide, in Lake McConaughey, 1.7 million acre foot reservoir. Water that is released typically from the reservoir will travel through Nebraska Public Power District's canal system, Sutherland Reservoir, location of Gentleman Station, Lake Maloney, Nebraska Public Power Districts, and North Platte Hydro is located there, and returned back to the Platte River near North Platte at Central's diversion dam. We pick the water up again at that point into Central's canal system, and a 75-mile-long supply canal water going through 3 additional hydro plants returned to the river near Lexington, Nebraska. In the irrigation season, we have irrigation areas shown in green, about 110,000 acres. I discussed previously the supplemental storage water, and you'll find these canals on the north and south of the Platte River, and also above North Platte in the purple line shown here. So these canals receive supplemental storage water from Lake McConaughey. I also want to talk briefly about the FERC licensed facilities. Central's FERC license covers Kingsley Dam, Lake McConaughey, and then jumps down to our supply canal, and these facilities along the canal, including the hydro plants, are part of our FERC license. Irrigation area is not part of the FERC license. FERC license was issued in 1998 after a fairly long process. The original license was granted in 1937, expired in 1987, 50-year license. Contentious process for that 11-year period as issues related to endangered species were raised more than once. I'm not going to get into the details of that. Those of you that were here and involved in it in some extent recall that, and we did work through most of those issues, and were able to achieve a negotiated settlement in '98. And new conditions. different from the prior license. An environmental account, baseflow requirements at North Platte, habitat requirements, and participation in a cooperative agreement. And I'm going to go to that last item for a few minutes and talk about that to give you a feel for what some of the issues during relicensing were. As I indicated, one of the big issues for the process, or in the process, was the endangered species, and this is the reach of the Platte River that was of most of the focus. Critical habitat for the whooping crane, least tern, and piping plover are additional endangered species of interest and concern. And as we go through the relicensing process, the issue was how much is Central going to do to address concerns, change your operations. Lots of proposal, lots of discussion. From Central's perspective, we wanted to talk about the basin. And I'm going to branch off into an area here and talk about the federal nexus. Those of you that are familiar with that know that when a federal action is taken on a permit, on a license renewal, then there is consultation required with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And what are the impacts on endangered species, for example? And that's not the only thing, but I'll focus on that narrow part. And so from Central's perspective, as we were going through relicensing, we felt that other entities, and you'll see in the green, other irrigated acres throughout the North Platte and South Platte Basin. We felt other entities who would be subject to the federal nexus should come to the table, and we should work through the issues in a coordinated manner. And so that wasn't just Central's issue. The state of Nebraska assisted with that process for a number of years. In 1997, a cooperative agreement was signed which says, okay, we're going to work together on this process. And when Central's FERC license was granted in 98, that was a condition: you will work on the process. So I just wanted to bring that up to give some perspective on the issues. Back to our FERC license, environmental account, 10% of storable Lake McConaughey inflows go into the environmental account. Releases controlled by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and releases would reduce shortages to the Fish and Wildlife Service target flows and provide water to supplement short duration high flows or pulse flows. Base flow requirements range from 850 to 1,000 CFS at Central's diversion dam at North Platte, so we have to meet those requirements on a monthly average and be pretty consistent, not to have much deviation. Habitat. 4 areas of habitat that need to be supplied: Jeffrey Island and agreement with Nature Conservancy, Clear Creek Wildlife Management Area, and the shores of Lake McConaughey. And in more detail, if you look at the Clear Creek Wildlife Management Area, western end of Lake McConaughey, managed by the Nebraska Game and Parks, over 6,000 acres for wildlife viewing and hunting. Shores of wrong button. Shores of Lake McConaughey, managed for least tern and piping plovers. And the complicating factors are this is during the season when you're going to have vacationers on the shores of Lake McConaughey. And so it is a challenge. It is something we work very hard at, trying to provide this protection at the same time trying to provide for an enjoyable recreation experience for tourism folks who come in to see Lake McConaughey. Activities include, typical activities are providing fencing, some sort of fencing around those nests. Problem areas usually arise from pets, animals that get loose and potentially damage eggs. It isn't just, the pets. It can be other wild animals too, raccoons, etc. Nature Conservancy Agreement, 700 acres of wet meadow managed near Sutherland. Jeffrey Island, over 4,000 acres. This was lands, the habitat lands that were acquired by Central after the issuance of the FERC license, managed for wet meadows, wetlands, and pasture. Now I want to spend a little time talking about the Platte River program. I mentioned the cooperative agreement beginning in 1997, and that created eventually a Platte River program was created in fall of 2006 and went into effect in January of 2007. And three major areas of interest: increasing stream flow in the Central Platte River during relevant periods, enhancing habitat in the Central Platte, and adaptive management. Target species: whooping crane, least tern, piping plover, and pallid sturgeon. And just a note on the pallid sturgeon, obviously it's mainly in the lower Platte, but concerns were raised about what is the effect of management in the Central Platte on the lower Platte. And that was the focus for that. As far as the target flows, reduced deficits to Fish and Wildlife Service target flows. The three initial projects: Tamarack in Colorado, Pathfinder, it's in Wyoming, biggest reservoir in Wyoming, and Lake McConaughey environmental account, were credited for 80,000 acre-feet per year of reduction to target flows of Fish and Wildlife Service. I want to stop for a second and talk about the Platte program and the financial aspect of it. This contribution on behalf of the three states and the water users within the three states was very important as we worked out fair share with the federal government and the states. It was intended, planned to be about a 50-50 match on contribution, and the water was credited at $150 an acre foot, so a credit of about $120 million from the states to use in that match. On top of that, we had $24 million from Colorado, another $6 million from Wyoming to get us to the $150, another $10 million credit for Cottonwood Ranch by NPPD and Wyoming's Deer Creek habitat. So that got us to the $160 million needed for the match with the federal government, and then the federal government would bring their match in terms of cash. Back to water projects, the goal would be another 50,000 acre feet minimum of additional reduction in shortages to Fish and Wildlife Service target flows. Adaptive management, a section. Just because we agreed on certain very specific milestones and goals in the Platte program doesn't mean there wasn't necessarily disagreement on other aspects of how do you do this? How do you provide habitat? How much habitat is needed? How do you create it, and do the species use it? And so there is a adaptive management plan and process to try to work through these issues. And I think it's been very important to have that. You have your milestones, and you work toward those. At the same time, you set aside a certain number of issues to do research upon and see what agreement can be reached on those issues. That is still underway. The shot of the Fish and Wildlife Service target flow shown in the kind of the boxed lines. The blue lines represent current conditions, and the orange lines represent the contribution from the Platte program, what that might look like if you get the 130,000 acre feet of reductions. Here's an example of the projects that were looked at to achieve the 50,000 acre feet, and it's a ranking. And here's your acre feet yield. And you'll see the one on the left is a re-regulating reservoir, and then the cost on the other axis. And so the blue line represents the cost. So the biggest yield for the buck was a re-regulating reservoir. We'll focus on that a little bit. I want to talk also about groundwater recharge and the Wyoming water lease as we go through some of the water projects. J2 regulating reservoir, multi-purpose benefits. The Platte program was looking at reducing shortages to target flows and pulse flows. When the state of Nebraska signed on to the Platte program, they reserved a share of water projects for integrated management. They felt it was important as they cooperated with the Platte program that we had a way to use some of these projects for dealing with our own issues. And so Nebraska said they would take 25% and use that for offsetting impacts of groundwater wells to stream flow. Central's issue was hydrocycling mitigation. You'll see a graph here, and there's a better graph on the next slide. This shows the operation of our J2 hydro, the last one on our system. And typically, we will operate the plant, we'll go to full load, 1,750 CFS, and keep it on until the generation for the day is out. And it will repeat that pattern on multiple days. As you can guess, that it has fluctuations, significant fluctuations in the river. And the orange line is what the release schedule would look like with the regulating reservoirs in place. So we'll get a little more explanation on that when we get in a few slides later. Funding, Platte program 75%, Nebraska Department of Natural Resources 25%, Central 2.5 million. This is a perspective on the location of the reservoirs, regulating reservoirs. This is the J2 hydro here. Water released would typically, as it is now, go back to the Platte River here. And instead, once the regulating reservoirs are built, it would come down the Phelps Canal. This is the Phelps Canal here because we'll talk about this canal a little later. Once the reservoirs are built, it would be dumped into these reservoirs and held or released back to the Platte River and smooth out fluctuations. Another schematic, water diverted at Central's diversion dam, goes through our system back to the river here, or when the reservoirs are built, it would go through the regulating reservoirs and back to the river. A couple slides of short duration, medium flow, over to April 1 of 2013, and then April 14th as the pulse flow is underway. An example of what the graphic might look like, and what you'll see is a graduated form of hydrocycling that Central adopts and uses during certain times of the year to address concerns of Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a three-step process to get to full load, and then offline. You see a couple of those cycles, and then a pulse flow here up to about 4,000 CFS. Another example of a water action plan project, putting water in a canal during times of excess to target flows, seepage back to the river at a time when a shortage. And so that is an example of a project that we are looking at. Phelps Canal, as we mentioned earlier, an existing irrigation canal, in September of 2011, empty canal, irrigation season's over. In October of 2011, it's filled back up for a recharge period. And during the October to January of 2011 and 12, about 6,000 acre feet into recharge. And then in December of 2012 and 13, another 4,000 acre feet of recharge. A slide of some of the monitoring, or a slide of some of the monitoring wells used during the recharge testing. Try to figure out what is going on, try to minimize any damages to farmland in the area. These are slides showing this is the recharge period, the rising groundwater level. In some of the monitoring wells, similar recharge period. Fluctuations you see are associated with adjacent groundwater wells during irrigation season. so far it's turned out pretty good as far as minimizing impacts to adjacent land for producers. A little slide of Pathfinder modification. The goal was recapture some 54,000 acre feet of storage in Pathfinder Reservoir in Wyoming that was lost to sediment. And they called it the 3 brick project, but the method used was to build an inner liner, if you will, an inner concrete wall that would serve as the new top of the reservoir. And when it would spill, then it would go over that wall and over the existing structure. Here is a shot of the existing structure during a spill. 34,000 acre feet would be dedicated to a Pathfinder environmental account to meet the requirement of the Platte program. Another 20,000 acre feet was reserved for Wyoming. The Platte program contracted for 4,800 acre feet from that 20,000 acre feet account, and so that is another water project that's on the books and is being used. In 2012, some 24,000 acre feet delivered to the Lake McConaughey environmental account from the Pathfinder Reservoir environmental account. So this is an example of changes in operation. This happens during September. We currently are doing some transfers from Wyoming reservoirs, much smaller, about 8,000 acre feet from Glendo going into Lake McConaughey. Now we've got another 20,000 acre feet from Pathfinder Reservoir coming into Lake McConaughey environmental account. And so operations are changing as a result of the environmental aspect. Here's a brief water project summary. 4,000 acre feet is credited for the Wyoming municipal account, 30,000 acre feet for J2 Regulating Reservoir. Recharge and water leasing, these are question marks. They are not firm. They're just example numbers of what might be used to get to their goal of 50,000 acre feet, but it's still being reviewed on which of those or how the program will meet their water goal. I want to switch gears and talk about Lake McConaughey and operation for other uses by Central, back to irrigation, back to power generation. How's this working? And what you see is a Lake McConaughey water year inflow. The highly variable areas where we have the big spills periodically. But the area I want to talk about are those 5 years from about 2003 to 2007. And those were some very low inflows in the 480,000 acre feet per year, where our average is about 1 million. And so these issues, this period of dry years and low inflow years in the 2003 to 8 period is a big concern for Central. Additional focus on that period. In these years, starting in 2005, Central changed operations from, and it's the first time in the history of the district that we allocated our irrigation customers. And so adopted an allocation of 6.8 inches per acre, 6.8, 8.4, back to 6.8, and then I think we ramped up to 8.4 and maybe 10. But nonetheless, for that 5-year period, we were very low on Lake McConaughey, under 400,000 acre feet in September of a couple of the years. So big concerns about where was the water system going, where was our water supplies going, and how are we going to deal with irrigation demands, minimum flows, release requirements in the winter. Big issues. And if we wouldn't have had very favorable rainfall during this 2007-2008 period, I'm not sure we would have come out of it near that fast. Obviously, we were very fortunate to have some very high water years in 2010-11, which filled the reservoir. But 2012 was a very dry year, and we are back in allocations for 2013 and 14. Here's a trend line that is a concern for Central. It's beginning in 1942 and looking at non-irrigation season. This is the winter season, flows into Lake McConaughey. a negative trend line, which is down by about 230,000 acre feet over that 50-year period, a 33% reduction from 1943 to 2013. So significant concern for Central, and in our view, the benefits that I discussed in our first slide are not sustainable with this kind of a inflow trend. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. As we look at Lake McConaughey, the original plan for Lake McConaughey is return flows from irrigation in the Panhandle. You see the irrigated area in the Panhandle here, getting water from the Pathfinder, Seminole reservoirs, Glendale Reservoir in Wyoming. And the plan was that those irrigated lands would provide adequate return flow for water into Lake McConaughey. There are no deliveries from Wyoming reservoirs. And it was recognized in 1945 by the United States Supreme Court that the lands east of Bridgeport, which is 60 miles from the Wyoming line, can be reasonably satisfied out of local supplies. And they looked at Lake McConaughey and said, here's this reservoir, here's this. They had 200,000 acres identified at that time for irrigation. And they said that is going to be fine. The return flows are adequate to take care of that. And so when they talked about local supplies, they were referring to return flows, but felt it didn't need to go past about, and when what he was referring to is a settlement of a Nebraska lawsuit in 1935 saying we need to take care of or allocate differently the natural flow. And so in 1945, the Supreme Court said, oh, here's the new plan on the natural flow, but at least looked at some other issues. Another example of decreasing surface water supply in the blue line and increasing groundwater development in the red line in Pumpkin Creek area. Looking at the inflows, or excuse me, the North Platte River above Lake McConaughey in 1950, some 26 groundwater wells. Currently, some 2,600 groundwater wells. So issues have been raised by Central and others regarding concerns about groundwater, surface water interactions. As we think about those issues, what we find is less surface water deliveries, and the last 10 years certainly are an example for Central's irrigators. Reduced recharge to aquifers, groundwater aquifer declines, lower return flows to the Platte Basin, lower return flows to the Republican Basin, reduced recreation benefits, and less hydro generation. I want to talk a little bit about 2014 and the activities taken by Central as we planned for this water year. In September of last year, and this is what we've done for about the last 10 years, we decide in September what the allocation or water plan is for the following summer. That gives our producers a chance to make their plans, decide how to transfer their water if needed. And we adopted a 9-inch allocation in September of last year, worked on a waiver of the winter release flows. I talked about those winter release requirements, and we're able to, through discussions with the Fish and Wildlife Service, achieve a waiver in cooperation with Nebraska Public Power District, a waiver of some of the winter release requirements, which helps Lake McConaughey stay up. We don't have to release as much water to meet winter release requirements. And then work through the transfers. If we have allocations of 9 inches per acre for our surface water customers, there's about 28,000 acres that don't have a groundwater well. And so those 28,000 acres are interested in a transfer. Those irrigators with groundwater wells are willing to say, here is my surface water allocation of 9 inches. You pay the water bill, and so they'll move those water allocations from one tract to another tract. Quite a lot of paperwork, but nonetheless, we've done that in each of our allocation years, and it's worked out pretty well. Then on those acres that use only groundwater, they're groundwater only, and so you've got an increased pumping situation there on those acres. So it's not free. There is increased aquifer drawdown associated with that transfer. How do our irrigators react? One of the issues is increased center pivot development. We've got up to 500 center pivots on central systems, so they can get by with less water typically. And it depends upon the water years. Some years you'll see center pivots get by with 9 inches. Other years it's going to take the 10 or 11 inches. How do we go forward? And I'm going to stop and talk a little bit about LB 962, passed in 2004, which is a first step at saying, how are we going to deal with conflicts between surface water and groundwater? LB 962 was passed. It says we're going to work on in areas, define an area of the state of Nebraska which was overappropriated, essentially the Platte Basin above, I'm going to say Grand Island, I might get that wrong. But that was on the Platte overappropriated. There had to be integrated management plans, and there had to be reductions, and eventually a movement back to fully appropriated. It was intended to resolve conflicts. I mentioned the integrated management plans and getting back to a fully appropriated condition. That's still underway. We're in our first 10-year process. The goals for the first 10 years in most of the plans, we're getting back to 1997. And obviously we would like it to go faster. NRDs would like it to kind of stay the way it is. And so we're trying to work through differences in those areas. But one of the other recommendations that came out of the LB 962 legislation and the task force was dedicated funding from the state of Nebraska for water issues. And that was in 2004, and we've had some funding, but it's not of a dedicated nature or a high enough level to really move into some of the integrated management, resolve disputes, in my mind, that need to happen. So a second task force was initiated last year, LB 517 task force. Their goal was to focus on funding. And from that task force, the LB 517 task force, you had a recommendation on funding and a recommendation on changes to the Natural Resources Commission. How do you take the dollars that might be available and allocate those to projects? And there was a reformulated commission just passed this year under this. I'm going to step through these steps, which essentially, develop a strategic plan, identify measures, and obviously get the funding. Now that was just this year, the funding step. So that's, get to this last slide or two. That's really where we are at, is the secure funding from the legislature. We've got, with the passage of 1098, LB 1098A, I think it is, there's a reformulation of the Natural Resources Commission, process underway now to receive application for those individuals to serve on the commission, and some funding is available for this year and even next year. And I want to talk about a few things as we talk about the legislative process. Central's perspective, Central's position has been, we want to see relief on the reductions in inflow into Lake McConaughey. And most of the discussion I've had is focused on groundwater pumping. And I want to make sure that everyone understands as we talk about that, there are other factors at play. And most of you saw the slide on increased center pivots. That's not just in Central's irrigated area, that is also going on in the Panhandle. And so as you go to more efficient irrigation methods, you are going to get a reduction in return flows just from that. So notwithstanding our discussion about pumping, there is another aspect, and I don't want to not mention it, that as you implement conservation measures, center pivots, and they are great for labor saving, they're very efficient for application of irrigation, there is a side effect, which means that the regime of the river is going to change. You're not going to have the return flows that you had in the past. With that, I think I'll stop and open up for questions.
Cooperative agreements still have a provision that any of the 3 states or the federal government can withdraw at any time with proper notice?
Correct. Yeah, the Platte program, we're out of the cooperative agreement. There's a transition from the cooperative agreement to the Platte program in 2007, but yes, any state can walk away at any time.
Is it your opinion then that if that were to happen in the future at some date, it would reopen your license?
I don't know about that. I think that depends upon how it goes, how it happens. I think you'd speculate on that one. There were very specific things in our license that said if A and B don't happen by a certain date, there will be a reopener. That was kind of an intent. Now, let's just talk about the J2 project. We have an agreement with the Platte program and the state of Nebraska on that project. There are provisions that if the program should fail, that may be picked up by individual states. State of Nebraska may stay in, and so that project could go forward for the benefit of, and they could still use that for their benefit. Even though the program would fail, there still may be some things that continue that might, each party, each state would now kind of be on their own saying, I'm covering my bases or not, and they're not doing it right. I think you'd still end up with a lot of fuss. Whether they try to reopen specific projects, I don't know. I don't know.
Don, the biological opinion for the Central Platte area says the Central Platte reaches short 417,000 acre feet of water. And I know you're working on 130 to 150,000 acre feet. Do you anticipate a second or possibly a third increment after the first one?
Good question, good question. That first increment was a 13-year period, 2007 to 2020. There's already some discussion about should we just extend the first increment because we're just getting the water projects in place, and you say, okay, what is the benefit to the species of these water projects? How are you going to operate them? How does this reduction in shortage play out, and what are these benefits? And in part, it's maybe we just need to extend just to evaluate for another period of time. That's one issue. Secondly, during the first increment, during this 13-year period, there is an activity which says evaluate the target flows. Are they appropriate? And that's another process that we would go through. How that turns out, I don't know. But you're right when you say in 1997, the deficit was identified as 413,000 acre feet, or 17, whatever it was. We're only biting off the 1/3 of that. Are those target flows appropriate? One of the questions as we're working through on adaptive management is, are those pulse flows effective in creating habitat? Now, there was a meeting this week. I was not at the meeting, but from the feedback I've heard is that was one of the topics. How effective are these pulse flows on creating habitat and maintaining habitat, and to the extent they aren't, is that really a process that you want to continue? So there are some questions being raised about how appropriate some of these target flows are. The study has not been completed, but it is a study that we need to start in the next couple of years, because that needs to be in place to inform us as we talk about a second increment.
Another question.
Don, from your perspective, is the adaptive management program that was put in place with the program achieving the intended purposes?
That's a tough one, Ann. You know more about this. It is, I think it's the right idea. is to separate those questions and try to work through them. I think it is still very tough to say, you know, and when not Bob McHugh, the last director of the Grand Island office retired in December, he said, you know, when we looked at the biological opinion, there are probably some things there that we didn't maybe do right. But it's tough to change your opinions, you know, this quick. And so I think the adaptive management is a very important piece. One of the things you're doing is bringing in outside scientists and saying, what do you think about these questions? What do you think about this biological question that's been teed up by the you know, adaptive management process? I think that's very important to have that step going on. So I think it's too early to say it's absolutely 100%, you know, solved all the questions or, you know, deficit. I think we're still working through it, and I'm encouraged that everybody's at the table and still talking, you know, hey, what are we finding? What's going on here? Some of the things that, you know, we have found so far, and I'm just going to pick one out, is the issue of is there adequate food supply for terns and plovers? Is that, you know, there's a big concern raised in relicensing, but I'd say the conclusion so far is there is adequate food supply for terns and plovers. That's not an issue. I'm not saying that's the only issue. There aren't other issues on habitat, but it's not a food supply issue. And that's coming from the adaptive management process.
More questions?
The right side has to speak too. There is a proposal by some of the NRDs to augment water in the Platte. And of course, they come up with some conclusions that you have excess water, yet today you're showing we got a declining water. How are those going to resolve?
Well, you're talking about some studies that have been completed by a couple of natural resource districts to, I think this is what you're talking, convert Central's irrigation system to groundwater only pretty much, and then recharge and then have water released down the Platte River. We have received some information, and we have made requests for additional information from the NRDs on that study, and to date we have not received that. So we are somewhat careful about saying anything with respect to that study because we're still waiting for information. But notwithstanding those caveats, we have concerns that as you take that amount of surface water delivery and surface water irrigation out and say we're going to groundwater irrigation on that whole area, that it could be unsustainable. It could be, I mean, we're just completing a study of the mound, and we do have a groundwater rise in our irrigated area generated over the last 50 years. And we've seen some bouncing around over the last 10 as we see some of the increased pumping, drier periods, had some wet periods in the 2010-11. Not sure where the trend is going on an existing groundwater mound. There are some that think it is in a state of decline, but some would also say the jury's still out. We're concerned about, and I'm not really answering your question, Jerry, but you know, on the one hand, I don't want to get specific on that study because we have not received the information, but we have concerns about it.
Other questions?
I am working with NRD dataset, and I am in process of measuring irrigation water use efficiency for each individual farmer field, whatever data they are reporting. So in that sense, I'm interested to know if there is any mechanism in place to quantify the return flow. Is there any mechanism available?
It's a good question. Is there any mechanism in place to quantify the return flow from our system? And I guess on the one hand, there are measurements, you know, if you can look at drains and those kind of things to get a measurement of return flows. We got some of that information. There are groundwater level measurements, and that's going to give you this groundwater level is either A, up, higher. And then last, and so you get those physical measurements, but also you have modeling. And so we are in the process of trying to develop a groundwater surface water model to say what is going on with the impacts to stream flow from pumping in our area. And this is from Lake McConaughey through Grand Island. That model is, you know, we essentially completed a major phase last summer, sent it out for peer review. We knew when we sent it out that we still had some issues with the model that weren't quite right. And so we've been working since last summer on correcting those. I think we made some good progress, not sure yet, but the peer review was pretty positive. You know, as far as the basic structure of the model, the peer review came back pretty good on it. So that's a plus. And hopefully we'll have a tool that will help us to answer that kind of a question. You know, right now I don't think we could use it or feel real comfortable using it to predict or estimate return flows. Clearly we can go out and get some measurements, and I can't really tell you the answer on are they going up or down.
A last question.
Thanks, Don. Just to follow up real quick on Jerry's question and build off that a little bit. There's been a lot of discussion of the future in Nebraska in terms of water management, conjunctive management, and that takes on a lot of different variations, but part of that is maybe groundwater recharge projects, managing surface water projects a little differently, or irrigation districts. From your perspective, as we move forward, is that a way to achieve some of our water management goals, is to look at more conjunctive management and doing those kinds of things?
I think it has to be explored. I can't tell you how that plays out. I know we're looking at it, Central Platte's looking at it in some of the irrigation districts, 30 Mile Canal and some of those canal districts. Cozad Canal is looking at that option. We've got conjunctive management in place right now. In other words, in our area, we've already, and it's a little bit out of necessity, we're moving to 7 out of the last 10 years where we've had allocations and more use of wells, less delivery of surface water. I think it's a little too soon to say how that is going to play out. I think it is an option, certainly, and it could be my mind, the way I would look at it is more pilot projects, more, let's say you were going to go to leasing for a period of time, you know, leasing of your surface water. You know when you do that you're going to have an increased groundwater usage. And so you can do that process of leasing your surface water, but don't make it a 20-year deal. Make it a shorter-term deal so you have a chance to say, this isn't turning out like we thought it would. I mean, I don't think we can have our models, and you know, we're having discussions on how they all work, how well they work, and to suggest that we know we've got them developed right, I think is a little bit premature. So my comfort level is, yes, we ought to look at those things, but do it on more of a short-term basis as opposed to any. But I think there is merit. I don't know how much merit, and I don't think I have that much trust in modeling yet to say.
I'll ask a last question as a moderator's prerogative. Very scientific. Are you still using goats for vegetation control on Jeffrey Island?
On Jeffrey Island. You know, I don't think so. I think we backed off and went back to cattle, so not using goats.
Just remind you that the irrigation tour is coming up the 12th through the 15th of July, and they can go to the Water Center site. Can they register yet? Soon. And students can start applying right away for the scholarships. The sheets are by the back door. Let's thank Don Kraus for a very interesting, expansive talk.